Welcome to the Friday edition of MLB Live for Lock right here at Awesemo.com. I am Jason Floyd, and I am joined by Terry McBride. Terry, man, how you doing on this early Friday afternoon, man?
Doing pretty good. Short slate of baseball, though. I already miss our big 8-game extravaganza from 2 days ago. We're down to 2 already. How that happened, but yeah, these playoffs have been fun. It's been a quick little sprint here through the first round. It's been a blast. I'm having a good day. How about you? How's things?
Everything's good, man. Everything's good. Ready to kind of break down this slate with you. Of course, we are sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. Tell you a little bit about them as we go on. Plus, tell you about some things got going on over at Awesemo.com today. We'll let you know right here from the start. MLB Top Pitchers is our free premium content of the day. So we know who 3 of the pitchers are, I guess is the best way to say it. We'll figure out who's going to be the San Diego starter as we go on throughout this show. But obviously with the 2-game slate, let's just kind of start here before we actually get into the games, is how are you building your lineups today with this slate, especially the fact of when we look at the later game, we have no idea who San Diego's putting on the mound at the top of the first inning.
Yeah, it's really tricky without knowing that. I mean, we can look at it that as, potentially favoring the Cardinals, but if they get a couple of these high-end, high-leverage type arms out of that bullpen and they just kind of stitch something together, that could be a tough spot for the Cards. It could be something where it's a little underrated for it to be a difficult situation if they're just facing strikeout pitcher after strikeout pitcher that's a 1-2 inning type high-leverage guy. So it's really tricky not knowing who that starter is. We were talking about it a little bit before the show, and you mentioned it, something that was coming up in your crunches, and I think it's probably a good idea, is maybe looking at leaning into the 2 pitchers from the Cubs game and then stacking some bats in this Padres game. That seems to be a really good thought. You're getting off of the exposure to Jack Flaherty with, his tough matchup against the Padres there, and you're buying into a pitcher that we all are going to be on and we all think is in a great spot in Yu Darvish. And then you're buying into a young kid who, I think we've developed a little bit of faith in over the season in Sixto Sanchez, and in a pretty good matchup against a struggling Cubs team. So it's really, really interesting for constructions, particularly, on DK and on FanDuel. It's a little bit more straightforward, I guess, but on DK, it's very, very interesting, and over on Yahoo as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about the 2 pitcher slates of Darvish, his ownership's going to be insane. We know that his ownership's even insaner on Yahoo. If you're playing on Yahoo, you pretty much everyone's going to be on you, Darvish. But the question is what do you do in that second spot? Do you look at Jack Flaherty? But Ken Rosenthal had a great tweet earlier today, and I mentioned it to you where he was talking about the Padres starters. Where in games 1 and 2, the Padres stars have pitched 4 1/3 combined, and then they've used 6 relievers in the rest of those games, and only once during the regular season did they use a reliever 3 straight days. So, I mean, look, that's regular season. This is a advance or go home situation. So obviously everyone's there for a window. We're going to talk about them in terms of some things that, who could they go with? Could we see a roster change in terms of maybe another pitcher gets, someone's taken off the roster, someone's brought in. So something we'll all play into is, it was interesting kind of starting to develop some of my lineups here early on. But game 1 today here in 1 hour from now in Chicago, Marlins versus the Cubs. Sixto Sanchez will be on the hill for the Marlins. Yu Darvish on the hill for the Cubbies. Over on FanDuel, Darvish 11,000, Sixto Sanchez 7,600, and then over on DraftKings, Darvish 9,000, Sixto Sanchez 7,800, and looking over at Yahoo DFS in terms of what they're priced at, $53 for Darvish in his spot. Sixto Sanchez, he is $41 over there. So first off, look, everyone's gonna be high on Sanchez, everyone's gonna be high on you, Darvish. I know there's already a question about, do you have to play Darvish? Let's talk about Sixto Sanchez as kind of, you've come around on this Sixto Sanchez, train here.
Yeah, a little bit. The kids pitch fairly well, and I just accidentally closed my document, so bear with me just a half a second while I pull up his numbers again. But yeah, he's pitched fairly well. He made 7 starts, 39 innings this year. He had a 4.08 xFIP to a 3.46 ERA. So I mean, even under the covers, that's a pretty good debut for a kid over his first 7 starts. 20.9% strikeout rate. You'd like to see that go up. It probably will as he goes along. Very good indicator of that is a 12.8% swinging strike rate. So the kid's got good stuff. It's functional on the major league level. He only allowed 3 home runs, all to right-handed hitters in his 39 innings. So we're getting a Cubs team. They were 11th in baseball against righties with a 180 ISO, 97 WRC plus. But they strike out 25.2% of the time. So there's enough Ks there for him to have a decent start. And there's a lot of struggling hitters in this lineup. The overall aggregate number is okay for them, but we expected the Cubs to be a better team than that. And if you look down this lineup, they've got hitters. Anthony Rizzo was the best of their struggling stars, and he had a 222, 342, 414 slash with just a 3% above average WRC plus. You get to guys like Kyle Schwarber, Chris Bryant, Javi Baez. All these big name guys had very tough seasons this year. So you're dealing with a struggling team. They've got plenty of track record. They're a proven team, no doubt about it. But this year, they've had their issues and they've been struggling. So Sixto could have a nice start here. I think he's definitely in play. I mean, there's obviously with only 4 starters, he's in play. But I think he might be in play more than people are getting to him, which is the important part.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the question is if you're going the Sixto Sanchez route. I mean, A, do you just want to, if you're not going to play Darvish, are you going against the ownership? Or B, do you just sit there and say, you know what, I really don't want any action in the afternoon, in the night game, in the pitchers there. In terms of Darvish, obviously, ownership's going to be insane. We both know that. But the question is, in terms of whether we're talking Yahoo, FanDuel, or DraftKings of him paying off that price and how many strikeouts and do you see a lot of strikeouts for him today going up against this Marlins lineup that obviously we do know what the lineup is?
Yeah, I think Darvish is poised to have a monster start here, and that's why we're seeing 155% ownership or whatever he's going to be. I mean, the dude's going to be in pretty much every lineup on a lot of those 2-pitcher sites, so it's very tough to avoid him here. The Marlins were dead last in baseball at a 128 ISO on the season. For a team with no power against righties. For a team with no power against righties, they had a 92 WRC plus, which is only 8% below average. You'd expect that to be lower. It's still not a good number by any means. It's below average, but you'd expect that to be something like what the Pirates were, like 65, 35% below average. So to get it done to that degree without power is interesting. They can scrap out some hits, but overall 24.2% strikeout rate in the split. Darvish struck out 31.3% of hitters this year. He cut his walk rate basically in half from his 8.6% career walk rate to 4.7 this year. He's just been lights out dominant all year long. Can you skip him? You can. You're probably sacrificing the highest probability of getting a boatload of starting pitching points, but you're getting far afield from like 90% of the field. So you are playing the leverage game. You are playing the ownership game if you do that. I even wrote up in Stack Slant, since there was really nobody else on the table, I looked for some low-owned Marlins. And, my basic take in Stack Slants was, can we stack Marlins against Darvish? Is there a point to doing that? So there are some bats in there that you can get to. It's not a big time play. It was definitely the way I wrote it up was not for the faint of heart. But yeah, it's baseball. Things happen. Weird things happen. Yeah, ground ball gets through an infielder, and all of a sudden there's a rally, and 3-4 runs go up. You never know. So.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the salaries on the Marlins bats here. Just look at the DK side of it. Brian Anderson is the most expensive at $4,300. You get Dickerson, who's leading off at $3,500. John Bertie second at $3,000. He was kind of come up with some one-off spots in terms of just that last roster spot in terms of my stacks. So in terms of salaries, I mean, look, if you want to go against the field, the Marlins is not going to be a stack that people are looking at. So I think there's definitely especially if you're a multiple lineup player, it is a thought process to go with. But of course, if you avoid Darvish, I guess the question becomes is, what 2 pitchers are you going with? Like that becomes a question mark, because I just said, we'll talk about that second game in here in a little bit, but man, I just don't feel comfortable with that. Now, looking at the Cubs bats, they were obviously a stack that was coming up a ton for me when I was over in Fantasy Cruncher. I mean, look, throughout this lineup, you like what you see, throughout the lineup. A question is kind of with the win situation in Chicago, how does that kind of affect what you're thinking here?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got to consider that wind blowing in. I think it was 10 miles an hour from left field. Is a little bit of a consideration. And we mentioned this lineup has struggled all year long, and it's the high name recognition, the high profile guys, the name recognition guys that you're talking about when you go down this lineup. The Chris Bryants of the world, the Javi Baez's of the world, the Kyle Schwarbers of the world. Those are the guys who were struggling this year. The guys that kept this team afloat were Ian Happ, Jason Hayward, guys like that in here, Wilson Contreras to a degree. So getting to some of those guys, you're getting onto the hotter players. All of these guys are drawing ownership, though. So you're buying into a struggling team in a bad win situation against the pitcher that we think is decent at high prices and heavy ownership. It's a 2-game slate, so you're going to have to do it. But trying to thread the needle, build the right stacks, and get to something that's going to be unique is really your challenge here. So you've really got to go digging in for, Jason Hayward, 17.6% owned, is one of the lower owned players in that team. Javi Baez, I really like at shortstop. He's 22% owned, but comparatively to the other shortstop, you get Miguel Rojas for less than that. But the other two shortstops, I believe, are going to be higher owned than that. So, and I think that's also how math works. I think I'm safe in saying that. I think there's an argument to be made for rostering Baez because of that. So there are Cubs definitely that we can get to there. On the Marlins side of things, you left out, I think, my favorite hitter on that roster, Matt Joyce, 2,100. Only 2,100. Under 10% ownership on DK. I love that spot. I'm not saying he's going to hit a home run off of Yu Darvish, but if there's upside for a home run against Yu Darvish on this team, he's one of the guys that's more likely to do it in this spot, and he's getting somewhat ignored, and he's basically free. So that's an interesting square over on that team. I don't love the hitters after him in the lineup, but I think the 4 guys ahead of him in the lineup are somewhat interesting. From Aguilar, Anderson, Cooper, Joyce, and Rojas, take that as a 5-man. That's the one I wrote up. I kind of think that's interesting. And actually, I'm just realizing you can't play Aguilar and Cooper on the same stack on DK because they're both first basemen. So maybe throw a Birdie in there, even though he's high owned. But I think there are things you can do with both of these teams despite a tough spot.
We'll mention this question from Adam. He says, play a couple of Chiefs Marlins, even if you're using Darvish.
Yeah, on a 2-gamer, I am willing to throw a bat against a pitcher, especially in the idea that hopefully he's out of the game after, he puts up, you're rooting for a good start. So you want to get him through 6, put up a decent amount of strikeouts, but then maybe he comes out after 6 and you get 2 plate appearances against the bullpen and you're hoping that your guy goes off there. Or you're just hoping you're grabbing one of the slate's 3 home runs that are hit and you're just getting the score that you need and putting it up and not worrying that it came against your pitcher because it's just one of the few big scores from a position player. So yeah, on a 2-game slate, I'm willing to roster position players against my pitcher. Anything beyond that, I really do not like the move. I think it's negative EV.
Of course, this is MLB Live Before Lock right here on Friday, October 2nd. Just under 1 hour from now, we'll have the Cubs and the Marlins. Do want to let you know today's show is sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. They are the most trusted name in fantasy sports. Yahoo DFS now includes CSV upload and CSV edit features where you're looking to play those multiple lineups, make better choices. Choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. Also, we'll let you know about a giveaway that we got going on right now over on our Twitter handle. And just head over right now at Awesemo_com. You'll see the pinned tweet there on about how we've got a giveaway for an Awesemo Plus NBA Platinum Year Pass. Go over there right now to Awesemo's Twitter handle to check out that giveaway that we do have going on right now. But game 2 is the Cardinals and the Padres. We mentioned about the topic, especially in terms of DFS here, is who's going to be on the hill for the Padres. That's the big question mark of where will they go. Morjon was listed on DK, but right now, I know right before the show, I was looking at all the Padres beat reporters. No one was, really noting where they could go. I was watching MLB Network. They were kind of, maybe, throwing it out there. Could we see a roster move from the Padres here to bring up one of their prospects? So, I mean, that's what makes kind of our job a little difficult here is because we have no clue who's going to be on the hill for the Padres, but we do know who's going to be on the hill for the Cardinals. So I guess let's first off talk about Jack Flaherty in this spot against that Padres lineup.
Yeah, so Jack Flaherty, pitcher I really like in general, had a weird year with, the Cardinals' various start and stops at the COVID thing and just it was a strange season for him. So I felt like we didn't even see him a ton, didn't get to use him for DFS in main slates at least a ton. He was in a few afternoon games and just a strange year, but pitched fairly well, 40 and a third innings, 3.42 xFIP to a 4.91 ERA. So it's a little bit more under the surface. So maybe some of the general public doesn't think he's pitching that well and maybe is a little sour on him. 28.8% strikeout rate, 9.4% walks, a little too many walks, but nothing terrible or very different from who he's been in his career. 14.3% swinging strikes is actually up from his 13 and change over the last few seasons. Excellent whiff rate on his slider to right-handed hitters, curveball to lefties. So very, very good pitcher. It's a tough spot against this roster, but there's nothing wrong with him. In a vacuum, he is himself. He is Jack Flaherty, pitching like Jack Flaherty. So maybe we get a little bit of benefit from the public not really realizing that. But the story is definitely the Padres in that matchup. Second in baseball with a 237 ISO against righties, 128 WRC plus, so creating runs 28% better than the average. Only striking out 20.6% of the time, walking 10% of the time. So they're getting on base, creating some of those opportunities we're seeing, and they don't sit down very much via the strikeouts. So it's a little bit challenging for him. I do think he's capable of putting up a good start here for sure, but I don't feel as safe with it as I do even with a 6-0 against the Cubs. I feel a little bit safer in that spot, which is weird, especially for me with a pitcher that I really, really trust. It's just this Padres lineup is just dynamite. I mean, they are so good. So tricky spot.
Yeah, just looking at what we have right now as a projected lineup of the Padres, I do know really wasn't getting much Padres stacks coming up, and I think that's obviously part of that is going to be when you're paying up for Yu Darvish. There's some lineup limitations that you do have, but Tatis obviously was coming up as a one-off. But Tommy Fan, I know there's been some comments in the YouTube chat about him as well as kind of liking him at his price point.
Yeah, Tommy Pham's a player that I always like to get to. It's 3,700. He's drawing a little bit of popularity, so you're not really sneaking that one past anybody, which is the one thing I would say as far as talking about it from a price point perspective. I like to get those price plays when I'm also getting a little bit of sneaky ownership on them. That's when they really, really shine. But there's nothing wrong with him by any means at 23%. Coming off the injury, it was a hamate bone, broken bone in his hand. That is a particularly difficult injury to come back from. Just the way the bat sits in a player's hand when you swing, it hits that bone in a certain way that we've seen guys really struggle with their power and with getting their proper swing back coming back from that injury. He came back very, very fast from that injury as well. It's usually a 6 to 8 week injury. He came back in like 4. He's around, I think, the 6 week and change mark now. So tough ask. Definitely a very good player, 2020 type guy. Really, really like him, like the spot in the lineup. So I definitely will have him. I definitely think we should roster him, but you're not sneaking it past anybody, like I said.
Yeah, just kind of looking at some of the ownerships that we have out there in terms of this game. In terms of the bats, obviously Colton Wong, he's coming off pretty high. I think that the Cardinals are going to be a very popular stack today, just primarily because of the pitching situation with the Padres of, whoever takes the hill in the top of the first inning, how long are they going to go? And then we've seen this bullpen get used so much over game 1 and game 2 of kind of, I think it's a good spot for the Cardinals here. Look, me, I don't really love doing the whole bottom of the order top on stacks, but like a guy like Dylan Carlson at 9 at 3,100 is someone that kind of, does stick out to me in terms of DK teaming up with the top of that lineup. And I mentioned this question to you before the show. At first base, who do you like more, Paul Goldschmidt or Anthony Rizzo?
Yeah, and I think we have to lean into Goldschmidt on that one. He's drawing a lot of ownership, so it looks like the public's going that way as well. I'll click over to see the compare and contrast number on Rizzo for ownership. So they're about the same ownership-wise. Goldschmidt's drawing a little bit more, but not anything like ridiculous. Price-wise, relatively comparable. I get a better home run mark on Goldschmidt, but it's very close now that I'm clicking over. Those guys are in a very, very tough dead heat. So just thinking about it in terms of I'm going to want to get to more Sixto Sanchez than I am of whoever the hell is pitching for the Padres, I would probably start looking at Goldschmidt lineups and just start building around him, as thinking of him as my first baseman on DK. You can flex it a little bit more on FanDuel, where you can play both of them. But I think, if I had to pick a first baseman to go with, that would be the one. It would have to be Goldie, just based on where I want to be with pitching.
Yeah, man. I think the other thing with this game is I expect you kind of expect it to be a little high scoring potential. Obviously it's going to depend on what do we get out of Jack Flaherty. That's the big question mark. But to me, I think you got to target Cardinals bats here. I really do.
Yeah, I like that call. And look, I don't mind going down to, it depends on where we're at. We don't have the final lineup yet, do we? I haven't seen it.
No, I haven't seen it yet.
I would think, it was hours before the game. I forgot we're 6 hours ahead of schedule. It depends on where these guys fall. But if you get like a Carpenter, Fowler, Bader as the last three in the lineup, some guys like that, there are veteran quality bats in that group that are reasonable, and they're going to be in the lower owned section of this swath of players, in the high teens, low 20s area. So grab a couple of those guys, build with some of the more popular guys. You can get to card stacks. They're just going to be very, very popular. So it might be tough to pay up for and make it work, but the other side is definitely better from the ownership perspective. You're playing it against a tougher pitcher. They're harder to get to as far as your builds go. It's very difficult to pull off. But I think that's where you want to look into as far as being different from the field. So it's a really tricky slate with these two games.
Yeah, I was just over at OddsShopper just looking at the odds for today's game. We don't have anything right now up on the Cardinals and the Padres. That's because, you don't know who the pitcher is for the Padres, so they're not going to set a line for that one. I did see the over/under runs 6.5 in terms of the early game of the Cubs and the Marlins. I mean, under plus 102. It's not. I don't mind that one.
Yeah, that's not outrageous at all. With Darvish on the hill and the wind coming in, I kind of like that.
I know.
Sports better in the world, but that sounds like, based on what I know about baseball, that sounds like a pretty good spot.
Yeah, you gotta check out OddsShopper over there when you're looking to place a bet on the games, as you can kind of shop around the various places to make a bet. But I do want to let you know, guys, sign up for an Awesemo Plus MLB weekly pass for $15.95. This gives you access to our player projections, ownership projections, the top stack tool, and the top pitcher tool. Sign up today by going to awesemo.com, right there at the top left-hand side of the page. Click on the Awesemo Plus. Sign up for a MLB Plus MLB weekly pass for $15.95. As I mentioned earlier on the show, today's free premium content is MLB top pitchers, as you got to try to figure out what you're going to do. We'll see what happens with San Diego. But let's get into some listener questions before we get out of here, leading up onto this game. As we kind of scroll down and look at some of the questions. By the way, go ahead and throw in a question right now. We'll get to your question before we get out of here. I know Richards was potentially, because he's thrown the least amount of bullpen innings in terms of the Padres, that could potentially be maybe where they go to start the game.
Yeah, it looks like Richards has thrown 13 pitches, 10 in game one and only 3 in game two. So that, I definitely think he's one of the more viable candidates. Moreland, it looks like, I guess, through 23 in game two. So I would probably scratch him off the board. Another guy who's, they've got a couple guys who are starter or former starters out there, Pomeranz, Pagan. So they could stitch it together, asking a few innings out of those guys. But each of those guys, Pagan's thrown 41, Pomeranz has thrown 37. So that's a decent amount of pitches in just 2 days. So I think Richards out of those guys is the most likely candidate. I'm not really seeing anybody else. Craig Stammen's not really that guy, and he's the only other one who only pitched in game one. So yeah, I think if we had to call it out, it would probably be Garrett Richards, at least for a few innings.
One of the comments in the chat was about Kyle Schwarber, and should you be concerned about him maybe getting pulled at some point for his defense?
It's not a bad thought, I guess, but I try and take some of those contingencies and some of those narrative-based things out of my planning, just because you want to account for it, I guess, but especially on such a short slate where you're so starved for any other better options, it's difficult to say, yeah, we're going to only see, 3.25 plate appearances when Schwarber should normally be getting 4.5 plate appearances. So take him out of your lineups. That's very difficult to say on spec. If we had, definites as far as the Cubs are going to be leading after the 7th, something like that, that we could act on, something tangible, then yeah, the Cubs could be trailing and might not do that because they might need his bat. So it's equal on both sides. So it's a very tough call to say yes.
Josh asks, he goes, who are we playing at catcher?
That's a good question. I am not really sure. I don't really like Wallach at the bottom of the Marlins lineup. I want to get to some sixes though, so I don't really like Caratini. It's probably Austin Nola or maybe Yachty. I guess it's definitely from that game. And just looking at it ownership-wise and upside-wise, it's probably Austin Nola. He's got more upside than Yachty does. He's significantly lower owned. 600 more on the price tag on DK. I think that's where we got to go, unless you're, outside of lineups with Flaherty, and even in some lineups with Flaherty. Nola, a little bit of power upside, 7 home runs and 184 plate appearances this year, 10 in 267 last year. So he's got a little bit of pop. I think that might be our guy.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting debate, especially on the FanDuel side of things. If you're going to play a catcher, or if you go the first base route, in terms of there, Mark says, if I'm playing one single entry lineup on FanDuel, what bats do I need to get in there?
Sorry, say that again. I was just kicking myself for not mentioning Wilson Contreras while we're talking about catchers, because obviously he's a very good catcher. He's going to be very. That comes down.
So this is Mark. He says, if I'm playing one single entry lineup on FanDuel, what bats do I need to get in there?
If you're playing one single entry lineup on FanDuel, what bats do you need to get in there? I don't know that I would say you need to get any of these bats in there. It's not a cash lineup necessarily. It would depend on the size of that tournament, as far as how far afield I would want to build. If you're talking about a single entry 20,000 entry tournament, then I would want to start building into some of these lower owned bats, maybe grab a couple Marlins, maybe grab a Matt Joyce who's super cheap and lets you do other things at low ownership. But I wouldn't necessarily say if it's a single entry 100-person tournament that you need to specifically have to have this bat or you're doomed. I don't really think it works that way. So I would say get to a quality stack, pay attention to what ownership looks like, and think of it in terms of the size of the field that you're playing in and where things are likely to be. Really the best I can answer that.
Yeah, I just looked at that Matt Joyce ownership on DK. It's nice. It's nice.
It's a great spot.
Yeah, no. You mentioned there. I mean, the question is like, you can take him at 2,100, or do you want to spend 3,000 more for Will Myers for essentially the same ownership?
Yeah, same ownership, and I mean Myers is a better player, but it's equally tough matchup, I think, or maybe slightly better matchup, but not anything where you're gaining spectacularly. Myers is a little bit more owned. He's 218 plate appearances. He hit 15 home runs this year. He hit 18 in 490 last year. So he's a good player, good bat, but similar spot in the order. He's going to see a similar amount of opportunity. So yeah, I think we save a ton of money. We get some home run upside still. We don't sacrifice that much. And yeah, we're building differently than a lot of the field.
Travis says, what are the chances Darvish gets lit up?
5%. I don't know. It's a baseball game. He's most likely going to put up a monster start here against this Marlins team. We went through it. They're last in baseball in power numbers as far as ISO goes, and they're below average in creating runs. So yeah, he is most likely gonna put up a huge start here. There is a world in which the Marlins hang 9 runs on him in the first inning. It's not a world that's going to come across. We're going to come across very often. It's one of those ones way out there, but it happens. And it's baseball. I mean, we saw the walks record for a postseason game get tied at 19 just the other day in the longest 9-inning game of all time. So these things happen all the time in baseball. Every time you watch baseball, you're constantly hearing, "Wow, it's a 150-year-old sport, but we've never seen this before." It's just a weird game. So Darvish could get lit. He could. It's not a good chance.
Got a question about what's your take on your favorite outfielders today? We know we've heard you talk about Matt Joyce, and primarily because of the salary of what putting him in line, but what that can do in terms of your roster construction. But as you kind of look at the rest of the slate, what are the outfielders that stick out to you?
So we touched on Pham, which I think he's definitely in play. We touched on Myers. So I think basically the Padres outfield's firmly in play. Trent Grisham, the lefty, should be leading off, decent profile against righties. So I like him. He's in play. Drawing a lot of ownership there too. 4,500 is in the mid-range in that Padres lineup price-wise. And then I think you can get to some of those Cardinals outfielders. They're a little bit lower profile. I mentioned, some of the lesser owned, lesser respected guys that are cheap, like a Dexter Fowler, a Harrison Bader later in the lineup for 2,500, 2,800 on DK. Also inexpensive on FanDuel. They're getting owned in the teens, the 20s, but they're not getting owned in the 30s and 40s like some of these other guys. So I think it makes sense to look to some of those guys. And then, we've got the obvious upside of the Cubs outfielders. They're very, very owned. But Ian Happ is one of my favorite options for MLB DFS across the board just all season long. I've been getting to him all year. Schwarber, I think, does still have upside. Hayward's had a great year like we've talked about. So, I like all those guys. And Corey Dickerson, who I mentioned at the start of the show, is in a not a great spot because it's Darvish, but in one of the better spots as far as the Marlins against him. But he's another guy who's going to be owned. So it's a dynamic question. There's answers on both sides. It depends on what we're talking about: projection, upside, or ownership. So I know I named most of the outfielders on this.
I do want to mention about a promo we do got going on right now over at Awesemo.com. You can see it right now in the chat. Get a Awesemo Plus NBA Weekly Pass for $5 when you use a promo code Orlando. Of course, we'll have Live Before Lock tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 hour before Game 2 of the NBA Finals. We'll see whoever is going to dress for the Heat as they've got some injury situation there. Mark says Dexter Fowler as a sleeper pick.
Yeah, I think he's in play for sure. He's a veteran bat that we've seen succeed over time, 2,500. I don't know that I would call him a sleeper pick at 25% ownership. That's a little heavy. I think Joyce is a bigger sleeper than that at a better price. Similar kind of a guy, similar kind of a profile. The matchup is probably not going to be as good just because Fowler you're getting from both sides of the plate, regardless of who's pitching. But I don't think he's as sneaky. But yeah, I definitely think Fowler's in play.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the stuff I printed up before the show in our MLB lineup builder, which we've already got the ownerships right in there of what they were when I printed it up. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the difference between the ownership in the Marlins and the ownership in the Cubs. Kind of tells you a lot about where everyone's thinking.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a 2-game slate, so people are going to be all over the board. We're going to see some really weird constructions. It's going to be one of those days where the people leading the early part of the tournament are going to be people who rostered 4 hitters against their pitcher, probably. It's going to be one of those wacky ones. So we got to look for our spots and really it's a low probability shot. It's a very thin needle to thread, but I think if you're looking for GPP upside, it's about those Marlins and that spot that nobody's going to be on. It's incredibly tricky to get to Yu Darvish in this spot. He's an excellent pitcher. This is not a good lineup, but we're playing DFS. That's what we're doing here. So we have to take that into consideration. We have to take the fact that Darvish is going to be 80-90% owned on DK into consideration. So with all those factors, a lot of indicators are pointing to the Marlins for me, even though they're probably going to get shut out and strike out 12 times.
Let's end on this question here. If you're playing a shortstop not named for Fernando Tatis Jr., who do you like the best?
Probably Baez. Well, that might not be true.
DeJong's getting some decent ownership.
That's the thing. DeJong was my home run pick. I think he's probably going to be in a very good spot regardless of who takes the mound. I really like the hitter, but the ownership is heavy. So I would probably lean more into Baez just based on the ownership. Similar kind of a player, probably overall a better hitter. It's very close from that regard. You're getting DeJong for a little bit of a lesser investment, but I think we pick up enough ownership capital there that it makes sense to pay up for the Baez spot.
Yeah, that's where I was kind of shortstop was becoming like that last roster spot for me, and it was becoming kind of okay. I was like, all right, I need to save some money somewhere else to get a shortstop that I want.
Right. And that's the thing. It's about, all right, there are 3 shortstops that we want, and then there's Miguel Rojas, who, by the way, for only 3,800 at 8.7% ownership on my last update, he had himself a nice little year this year. 304, 392, 496, 42% above average WRC plus. He's not a power hitter by any means, but over 143 plate appearances. We can work with that. That's not bad. So I think he's in play.
Wow, I just looked at our latest ownership updates on DraftKings with you, Darvish.
Everybody.
Pretty much. Pretty much. I mean, yeah. That's I really think I'm leaning towards having several lineups of stacking Darvish and Sanchez.
Yeah. I think,
even though I think Darvish and Flaherty will be kind of the chalk on the 2-pitcher slate. I'm just trying to go, how can I, help myself in terms of lineup construction?
Yeah, we want to get different from that. We want to get away from what everybody else is doing. And based on the ownership projections, that is what most people are doing. I think it'll be interesting to see what comes from the Padres, if we get any kind of news, or, if we can figure out a way to put a placeholder guy there that we can switch to with enough possibilities. It could be funky to do it that way, because not going to be anybody out there doing that, and none of the optimizers are going to be doing that. So think about that, and just, make sure that you have outs if you go that route. That could be a different way to get different at pitching, but I think the smartest way to get different with pitching is what you said. Go with the Darvish and the 6-0 stack, and then play your bats from your other game. Maybe throw in a bat from this game to keep it even further afield.
Yeah, I mean, it's all things you got to think about as you're building your lineups. Of course, the first game will start here in about 40 minutes from now. Of course, keep it locked here at Awesemo.com all day long. We've got fancy NFL coverage coming for you today. Also, we got NBA live before lock. So be sure to check out everything over at Awesemo.com. And, of course, the MLB Top Pitcher Tool is today's free premium content over at Awesemo.com. So that's going to do it for this edition of MLB Live Before Lock.